5% of Fortune 100 companies.
Yep.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And 60% of the Global 2000.
Excellent. So walk us through, what is the DRI?
Yeah, so it was founded in 1988, and it was the Institute for Training and Certifying Emergency Management, Risk Management, Disaster Recovery, whatever name, they keep rebranding themselves. And me, as the kind of representative of the profession, I said, stop rebranding. Accountants have been accountants for like a long, long time. So just communicate your value effectively. Disaster risk professionals, more recently, resilience professionals.
So how'd you find yourself there?
So it's a ridiculous story, really. I started as a temp. I thought I was going to work there for one day. And then 9 years later, I became CEO. So basically, I was assisting the executive director. And so what I tell my students now at NYU is it's more important to be around smart people who you can learn from and somewhere where you see opportunity than in the perfect job right out the gate. So because I had access to the executive suite and I was taking minutes for board meetings, I had a good sense of what was important at the Institute, what was happening in the profession. I could get to ask questions. And I was also helping in setting up our international training network, so licensing our training classes in other countries. And I absolutely loved that. As a global affairs person who probably should have been a diplomat maybe in my next life, I really loved it. I could talk to people from all over the world and travel and go to conferences and build a business. And so eventually they offered me that role, and I got to be entrepreneurial. I grew the international side of the business to be 40% of the business. And then I was being considered for executive director, which was really a COO role. That was how it was conceived. I was already doing a lot of public speaking and a lot of media on behalf of the organization, so they sort of reimagined it for me. But I was offered that role, and it became quickly apparent that that meant taking on the 60% of the business that was domestic. It was the legacy side of the business, the older one, more established relationships, a lot of potential wires to trip over there, right? So that was interesting and very new for me. And it became quickly apparent that it was really a grooming role for president and CEO, but that had to be voted in by the board of directors. So I was kind of being put in front of them.
So you mentioned the international business. Before we get into the Q&A, the formal Q&A, kind of curious, do executives or leaders in other countries and cultures think of risk fundamentally differently than, say, we do?
Yes and no. So I think what's interesting is how we would grow into different markets. And so typically how I saw that happen is somebody from the central bank of a certain country would say, we need more resilience, usually in our financial services sector. But it could be elsewhere as well. We want to grow our industry. We want to be seen as a business-friendly, safe place to do business. How can we improve our standing in the world in that way and our reputation? So they would go and take our training classes somewhere else, and then they would say, okay, how can we bring this here? And often they would help us to sort of organize a first event or a launch event with intros into the kind of financial services community. We would also grow on the back of kind of the US companies that were going further into their supply chains to make sure that they had strong, robust risk management practices and resilience built in as well.
Okay. So when I looked at some of your interviews, and you got called a lot when that barge slammed into the Baltimore Bridge.
Yeah,
right?
The Francis Scott Key Bridge. Fun fact, I have a 3-year-old, and he still occasionally will talk about the Francis Scott Key Bridge falling down.
Because he saw mommy talking about it on TV.
He saw mommy talking
right.
about it. He
right.
was fascinated by the video, and he's a boy, he loves trains and cars and things.
Well, I want to get to that in a second, because the way that the media kind of grabbed hold of that scenario and the fears of this being a weaponized type of barge scenario, that's interesting. But one of the things that struck me in a lot of interviews, you refer to the world as being in a polycrisis.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
So a couple of things. One, the polycrisis means that it seems now to us that the world is just constantly one crisis after another. And in some senses, that has always been true, but we have not necessarily been as interconnected, as interdependent as we are today. And so that means that a crisis that happens on the other side of the world could very easily affect you on this side of the world, and very rapidly, because everything spreads so rapidly, because we have globalized interconnected supply chains, because services circle the world very rapidly as well. And we saw this with COVID-19, for example, the rapid spread of it. So I remember in January thinking about, okay, this is happening in China. Well, regardless, the first article that I wrote for Forbes about that was this is going to affect supply chains because everything that happens in China, I was thinking, avian flu, swine flu, this is going to affect our supply chains. How do we prepare for that aspect of it? But then when you see it cropping up in Italy, you go, this could be the big one. Because, I've been sitting in on briefings from the CDC and the FBI about pandemics for a long, long, long time when it was not like a fun thing to talk about. And you're like, okay, is this the big one? Is this the one we're talking about? And what was fascinating was that we actually had a conference, and I will get back to Baltimore, I promise. But we actually had a conference in the first week of March of 2020. Mm-hmm. And so this is the disaster experts, the people who are charged with operational planning for pandemics at the largest corporations in the country and in many cases the world, although that one was not very international, unsurprisingly. So all of these people were supposed to convene. Of course, there was a high cancellation rate, but there were also a lot of people who got kind of the don't travel orders while they were en route or while they were actually there. But what I found most interesting were all of the companies who said, what kind of conference are you going to? Okay, you go and come back and tell us what everybody else is doing to prepare for this. And so all of our programming became rerouted to just roundtables of smart people who were like, okay, what are you doing? What are you doing? What do you have in place? How are we planning? How can we kind of help each other and prepare for this thing that we've been talking about as an industry, as a profession for a long time? So I became kind of talking a lot to the media, a lot of representative of sort of the business side of COVID and sort of the business complications of something like COVID. And then what did that mean in practice? A lot of supply chain disruption. Mm-hmm. So suddenly this thing that nobody talked about outside of the business press, right? Like talking to consumer audiences about supply chain felt like a rather new responsibility, and I had to kind of explain it in terms that made a lot of sense. So that's why I became the person that they called during the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge.
Right.
And the way that my brain thinks, and I again wrote a Forbes article about that and published it pretty quickly, and it was saying, okay, so here's what the economic implications are going to be. Because I'm thinking it's a very important East Coast port. It's a roll-on, roll-off port. You have a lot of automotive that comes through that port. It's deep water. It's not as easy to do in other ports on the East Coast that are already overwhelmed. We had just come out of kind of like the port strikes on the West Coast and the port backups during COVID that had such a great impact on inflation as well. So if you lose Baltimore, which is such a key port for an extended period of time, does that mean we have to move more product again through West Coast ports, which increases reliance on trains, on freight, that makes everything more expensive again. It causes car prices to go up, which they were already high, which is causing more strain on the automotive industry, which is already under a lot of strain because they're having to invest for the long term in energy transition technologies that are very expensive and are not going to pay off for a while, and they're still having to educate the consumer about why they should invest in these new technologies personally. So my head is always thinking like a few steps down the line to see how we can plan for that effectively for doing what's called consequence management or effect management, saying like, okay, how will this manifest? What are all of the areas that it will touch, and which ones are kind of the highest value or the core things that we have to protect at all costs, whether because they generate a lot of revenue for us, whether because we have a lot of people there, something that we really have to protect. And so that's what you need to be thinking about when you say, uh-oh, a bridge collapsed. My day is going to change completely now because I have to deal with that, even if you're not like in the city of Baltimore.
Sure. So there are obvious supply chain carryover effects. If if the Strait of Hormuz, if Iran ever blocks it, we know we can calculate how much oil won't come through, and you can kind of do a supply-demand curve of what that means for the price of oil. Mm-hmm. I am curious. You mentioned that we have the increased interconnectedness of supply chains, but we also have increased interconnectedness of communication. Mm-hmm. And so I remember when the Baltimore Bridge collapsed, when the barge went into it, the narrative I think I heard in popular media was, oh no, this might have been a weaponized case of disenabling a barge's communication system and allowing it to float into this bridge. And then immediately there were maps put up on social media of all the other bridges that were potentially, remember this, right? This was it, and that never materialized, right? So I guess the question is, to what degree, not underplaying the reality of interconnected globalization and supply chains, to what degree does the hysteria machine that we have now layer into that?
So there's a couple of ways that I think about this. One is that a lot of that is plausible, that is an attack that could happen, right? You could see these kinds of container ships be weaponized. If I was looking at all of the disruption during COVID, I would go, well, this is a great way to cripple an economy, right? And you could do it through toilet paper or whatever it is, right? Like it's going to cause a lot of chaos and disruption. And so if you're just looking to cause kind of indiscriminate chaos and disruption, that might be one way to do it. You could do it through a cyber attack. And this is something that the government does worry about. Like I'm also on the FEMA National Advisory Council, which is an advisory board for the FEMA administrator. And this is the kind of thing we talk about and plan for. But another aspect of it that I think is really interesting is the mis and disinformation aspect of it. So even if that, like, yes, it's absolutely plausible that could happen. Even if that's not what's happening, there are plenty of actors who are interested in you thinking that that is what's happening. Because that can also sow chaos and disruption, even if it's just for a short period of time. We saw this a lot with Hurricane Helene as well. There was a lot of mis and disinformation about what FEMA was doing, what they were not doing. You know, there's certainly, in some ways, a kind of a misunderstanding about like FEMA as a first responder. FEMA's not a first responder. They're going to be dealing with later on effects and really supporting state and local government with what they're doing on the ground. But really the first responder is all of us, right? We have a stake in personal preparedness and we have to be there on the first line. So mis and disinformation in a disaster situation is an opportunity to spread chaos and sow chaos in a way that is very cheap and is really of interest to any of our potential enemies. And I think we're going to see a lot more of it.
Does everyone remember the great toilet paper fiasco of 2020? Remember?
Does anyone still have toilet paper in their closet?
Yeah. So I put bidets in all my bathrooms. I thought I was so smart. I was like, I'm going to hack this. Everyone else is panicking about finding toilet paper, and I just bought bidets and installed them, and I just thought I was brilliant. And
Not like the Toto toilet?
No, full-on bidets.
Okay. All right.
Full-on bidets. I grew up
You went very
Italian,
French.
so I know
Okay.
how to plumb.
Yeah.
I'm a plumber by trade because all Italians are.
comes with the blood,
No,
yeah.
we come out of the womb with a plunger.
Well, I'm Serbian, so I don't think we want to talk about what comes with our blood.
And every time I look at them, because I've never used them, and every time I look at them, I'm reminded not to panic. They're my little don't panic, like note card. So
Expensive, don't panic. Not
very
right.
expensive, yeah. And they take up space.
You could have just put keep calm and carry on above your toilet, you know?
So we have misinformation, we have disinformation, we have just innocent misinformation where people just panicking for the sake of panicking. But then we have embedded in that very, very real cascading risks that we have to deal with because of a globalized supply chain.
Yeah.
Okay, so polycrisis world. Is this a new thing? Are we currently in have we always been in a polycrisis world? Just didn't realize it, or is this a relatively new phenomenon? And if so, why?
It is getting more intense and faster, and so that is of concern because if you think about the term weaponized interdependence, right? And this is something that the US has certainly been using very effectively for a while, is recognizing that we are very interdependent, and are there ways that we could pull on some of those levers with something like sanctions or tariffs, or spying through the NSA on communications channels because we're all connected via the internet, via globalized supply chains. So like I said, anything that happens in China is going to affect us here in the US and very rapidly. So it's not that it's totally new, it's just happening a lot faster. And we know about it more, right? So like you might be totally safe wherever you are, but if you're constantly doom scrolling, you're seeing all of the bad things that happen everywhere, and that affects your psyche over time. And so you might have this feeling that we're in a polycrisis, when really, in a lot of ways, life has never been better for most people, for the average
That's a great point. I mean, is some of it? So
I stole it from Steven Pinker. He's a Harvard guy, I hear.
Yeah, he wrote a great book called The Rational Optimist, which is wonderful, and I suggest everyone read it when you're feeling down on yourself, because it just reminds us of how far we've come just in the last 100 years. Whenever I get into these discussions with people who are overly pessimistic, I just ask them one simple question, which is if whoever you believe in as God came down and said, here are the dice, you can roll them again and be born any other time in human history, you'd be insane not to choose right now.
I'd like really the Standing Stones, Outlander. It could be fun. It seems charming.
I mean, maybe.
I think the reality might just be a witch trial, right?
If you're not a white guy, you'd be really insane not to choose right now. And even if you are a white guy, just statistically, maybe 1998, that might have been fun for a bit. But anything before,
80s looked pretty fun.
You're getting leeches from medicine. and there's no phones. So I agree with that. One question for you though. So we have an interconnected world, but part of what I think is maybe bothering us as Americans is the rest of the world's always had to deal with this. Meaning, the U.S. has sneezed and made everyone else catch a cold for a very long time.
Very
I think
powerful
what's
position.
new is it's coming the other way.
Yeah.
I remember a long time ago when I was a student abroad, somebody said to me, you know why some people don't like Americans? It's because the election of your president matters more than the election of mine. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to deal with. And it just seems that now we're coming to the realization that maybe some of that flows back towards us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of a unique kind of post-World War II moment where we had this really important, and then fall of the Soviet Union, it felt like, you have that classic end of history. Every time anyone at the Council on Foreign Relations brings up the end of history, it has to happen at least once, an event. How wrong we were about the end of history.
You're also a member of the CFR, which is
Yes.
incredibly impressive.
So we talk about this time, but really that's almost an artificial amount of power. Although you could make the case that with artificial intelligence and all the technological advances, we will continue to reign supreme for a while. But what I am hearing on sort of the governmental side is that both the U.S. and China are in this sort of like pre-war posturing. I mean, I hear like within the Department of Homeland Security talking about we're in a civil defense posture now. And that to me is really kind of an unsettling thing to be thinking about.
Jamie Dimon said,
and I don't know if that's coming through to the consumer so much.
I mean, Jamie Dimon said this week, we are in World War III. He used those exact words. He said we are actively in World War III at the moment. Right.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I think if China invades Taiwan, we'll be in World War III. I think until that happens, we're in if it feels a little bit like that, the Ever Given, like the slow-moving giant ship that you can't turn around. That's kind of what I feel like.
So our mutual friend Ed Price, who's spoken here, who's
Works
a geopolitical expert
NYU.
as well, right? Good friend of both of ours. Who's the biggest pessimist, and when I say biggest, literally, he's like 6'12". He is extremely pessimistic, but his theory is that we won't see an active Chinese blockade because to do that, they'd have to sail their naval ships through Japan, where we have a naval fleet, and that would be a kinetic war. Yeah. So his theory is it'll be a soft blockade. What do you think about that?
All right. So it's not just that, but also like if you have an amphibious invasion of Taiwan by the Chinese Navy, which certainly they've built up a very powerful Navy, but that's just an extraordinarily costly thing to do in terms of the toll of human life. Think about the fact that you've had a one-child policy in China for so long. If I can think of a better way to make your population despise the people in power, it would be to kill off the only child that people have because of a government policy. And I think that Xi Jinping and the CCP are very interested in maintaining power, even above maintaining economic dominance. So I think that that is more likely that they will avoid something that is an out-and-out invasion. So I think they're looking for more like an opening, like something I've modeled through with the Pentagon, for example, is like if they're, again, disaster lady, right? They call me about disasters. And so the issue would be, what if there was a Fukushima-style tsunami that hit Taiwan and there was a massive humanitarian crisis on the island and the Chinese naval ships, because that's who delivers that kind of aid, the Chinese Navy just shows up with lots of humanitarian aid. Do you let them onto the island? Who decides? Who decides to not let them on when people are dying and there are bodies in the streets? If you let them in, do they ever leave? So maybe they're looking more for like that kind of opportunity, something that is going to be not an outright invasion, but just a slow encroachment. The fun fact that might be amuse this audience is that like at this kind of communications with, U.S. government, Joint Chiefs, these kinds of people, I asked like, have you considered like what the impact would be on supply chains or the private sector given, TSMC and chips and Taiwan, and there was just silence. It was just not their remit, right? All of these things, all of this planning still happens in these silos. And I'm just always the person who's saying like to the private sector, consider the public sector, and to the public sector, consider the private sector. You have to talk because, again, we are interdependent. And in a polycrisis world, a crisis that affects one of us affects all of us. Disasters don't understand whether you come from this sector or that sector or this country or that country. So you have to think about it more holistically, and you have to work together.
So we have as one of our guests, we have a semiconductor analyst, and one of
makes
the
sense.
theories floating around is that, so we have the CHIPS Act, and even though these big fab facilities take usually 10 years, we're moving very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And so the theory
Kind
is
of like
that
Operation Warp Speed, right?
yeah, exactly. So the theory is that 3 to 4 years in Arizona specifically, we'll have
The place with no water. Good planning there.
70% of Taiwanese capabilities.
Yeah.
And the theory is that Xi Jinping, because he doesn't want a kinetic war, will sort of time his increasing soft blockade of Taiwan to sort of match that timeline.
Yeah.
So there's no reason for us to go in and fight because we can kind of, that's the theory at least. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the
Plausible?
rumor is
Not
like
likely?
2027, right?
Yeah.
So that's what they're planning for.
Yeah.
I've had kind of entrepreneurs on the Japanese side who have, or are talking about the Chinese kind of coming to them and saying, like, how can I buy your intellectual property for whatever it is that you're manufacturing? Because they've been so good at kind of the basic manufacturing, the more complex stuff they're not so good at. So if they're thinking, I need to be able to do these things so that we can be self-reliant as an economy, were we to be totally closed off from the world in 2027, that's what they're focused on.
Okay.
From a supply chain planning perspective. So I don't think that's totally off base. We have shown an incredible ability to act quickly when pressed, which can come as a surprise sometimes when our rhetoric is so pessimistic a lot of the time, and we're so chaotic a lot of the time, and yet I think Operation Warp Speed, for example, is a great example of kind of industry coming together with government and saying, like, let's get it done. Let's do something daring, bold, creative, leveraging advanced technologies to see if we can find a way out of this crisis in a faster way. It's just the public messaging side of it where they really kind of messed up there.
I do find the pessimism extraordinary. We caught a rocket with a giant pair of chopsticks last week. I mean, that's
cool.
just, it's so extraordinary. And that kind of
Distracting
got
the
brushed.
astronauts who are stuck up in space, Boeing still got problems.
Were they stuck, or were they just kind of like hanging out? Like the subway stopped for a little bit. Everyone freaked out.
I have a
but then it
friend
kept
who's an
moving.
astronaut, and I was like, what is the thing when you came back that like surprised you from that experience? And he was like, I couldn't hold my head up. Because in zero gravity, like somebody who is like muscularly, like an astronaut, right? Like he had to like completely relearn how to walk and how to hold his head up.
Wow.
Yeah. So like being stuck up there.
Let's train those guys into shape. So you said to me, and then we'll move on to sort of more detailed questions about how leaders behave. But I want to talk on China one more thing, because you made a very interesting point, which is the Chinese government is not in complete control of its people, in the sense of it has to be worried about it. Because I think there's this perception that they are so dominant that it doesn't matter. But we saw during COVID, we saw the leaks of those condominium developments screaming. And then we saw a backtrack of the CCP around the COVID policy. So they are vulnerable to populism to some degree. Is that fair?
There's also the laying flat phenomenon of young people in China not wanting to work as hard as they need to in order to keep the system working, as you have an aging population and fewer young people to support them.
Can you explain what lying flat is? I'm sure people won't know it.
Yeah, so it just means that young people who are saying, like, we don't want to work as hard as we're being expected to, we don't see the kind of economic value in that for us, and we'd rather just kind of stay home and play video games or, be lazy rather than the patriotic working hard, because they just don't see what's in it for them.
Right. It's literally a meme. Like the young Chinese professionals are showing themselves lying. Remember, like they're lying face down, or they're lying just prone on their apartments, and they're using it as a sort of a rebellious message against the government, whose message is, work for the state, work for the state. Yeah.
What I will say in terms of like control, and I'm by no means a China watcher. Everyone has to say, like, I'm not the China expert, because the China experts are in a corner saying, you know nothing about China. But I studied abroad in China in 2001, so this is like quite a long time ago, and in Wuhan of all places. But I did travel around a lot, and it was just much more kind of like chaotic, and had that very much that can-do attitude. And as over time, particularly, and then I would go every couple of years for DRI because we would have a conference there. And I enjoy my time there always, but like you get the sense of everything is on camera, which is true here too, by the way, right? Like every square inch of Manhattan is covered in cameras, which is true in Beijing as well. But in our case, they're sort of like public and private, and they have to get subpoenas to access them and all of these things. It's a little bit more, there's a little bit more room for freedom, or maybe people just don't know. But in China, it does have the chilling effect that people are behaving in a way that I didn't see in my earlier travels in China.
So my last trip to China, saw this with my own eyes. Waiting at a crosswalk, the light began to turn, hadn't turned yet. A Chinese woman stepped into the street prematurely. She jaywalked, which, by the way, just became legal in New York as of today.
I know.
Yes.
Eric Adams is trying to win us back.
There were these, there are these TV screens on top of the stoplights. She stepped into the street. Within seconds, her image showed up on that screen, and there were Chinese lettering around it. The guy I was with, I asked him what it meant. Everyone stared at her. It had put up her name, her offense, jaywalking. It had deducted points from her social score and named and shamed her all in real time. So it's not so much about the collection of data, it's how it's used.
Yeah, of course.
And we trust, so far at least, our government has not chosen to use it in that way, but the Chinese government has absolutely chosen to use it that way. And again, so far we haven't seen sort of mass uprising or mass rebellion against it, which is, these people I was visiting, I had taught them in a global banking course at Columbia, and when I asked them, are you okay with this? Now maybe they thought I was a CCP spy myself, but this was at drinks. And
I doubt it, but okay.
Their attitude to me, these are nice people.
Yeah.
They weren't bad people. They turned around and said, well, we're good citizens. So it works great for us because we get better interest rates on loans, all these advantages.
I got that answer too. A lot of we feel safe.
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah.
And honestly, as a woman traveling alone for business, walking on the street in Beijing alone at night, I was like, well, I do honestly feel safe in this moment. But is the trade-off worth it? That's the question, right?
I think we like to think that we wouldn't succumb to that, but I'm not so sure.
I think it would look very different here. It does, right? Like you got to get that Clear app so that you can get into the stadium earlier, so that you know what I mean. Like it's just a different system of doing it.
Things, right?
We
but
do.
If it works. Look, I was in the UAE for 2 weeks, and walking home 2 o'clock in the morning, drunk, no fear. I mean, there's as true blue an American I am. There's something to be said for the allure of benevolent dictatorships or perceived benevolent dictatorships.
It's certainly gaining in appeal. People like what the idea. If the perception is that government doesn't work effectively. And that authoritarian regimes can get stuff done more effectively, then that narrative is out there. But what I would say is that I'm not sure that that's actually very accurate. Like you talked about some of the problems in China, right? Like they were just kind of literally boarding up people's doors, right, during COVID to lock them into their apartments, whether they had baby formula for their kid or not. Didn't matter. And in the U.S., we actually have made a lot of improvements to our systems. It's distributed, right? Like we have federal government, state, local government. If you had one negative experience a while ago, you're just going to write it off forever. I do think it's actually gotten a lot better. I also do see that, we had kind of the Project Maven days at Google where, Google employees were saying, no, we won't work with the Department of Defense. We will quit over this. This is not acceptable. That's changed. Yeah. It really has changed. I think COVID was part of that, the rise of China, a lot of this rhetoric has changed in ways that have pros and cons, right? But I do see that the tech sector and the government are collaborating more these days in ways that we have yet to see the effects of fully.
I don't want to live under those systems, but I appreciate why people do. It's particularly if they're people who view themselves as vulnerable. The safety aspect is
until they're in a minority that is
until they're minority, until they run
not
afoul.
Appreciated.
I won't say which country, but I got a call from a regulator in a Middle Eastern country because they had one of their companies was going bankrupt, and they were wondering if I knew anyone who might want to buy it. And the long and the short of it is, I wanted to make sure there was no fraud, and so I asked 3 times, "Are you sure it's not? It's just financial bad management?" Yes, John. I'm like, "Are you sure it's not fraud?" And they're like, "Yes." I'm like, "Will the CEO be available for me to interview?" And they said yes. And I said, "How can you be so sure?" "Because I have her passport in my hand." Literally the response. So you remember, if you run afoul of that system, it turns fast. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's get to things that may be useful for people in the room who are leaders of the companies or just for personal life. So what are some of the characteristics of really, really good either government or corporate leaders the best ones who've thought about risk? What are some characteristics of those people?
Well, they have to have thought about it.
Okay, step one. Yep.
Yeah, no, seriously, because think about it. Like, it was actually very interesting to be a CEO for a long time who was responsible for a P&L and revenue generation in an industry where people are really more on the cost center side of things, and they're thinking about, managing risk all the time. So different priorities. But you don't get to the C-suite if you're someone who's uncomfortable with risk. You have to be an optimistic person who likes to gamble, who likes to go out there and say, you know what? There's an opportunity here. There is money to be made. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to put myself out there and I'm going to prove this to the world. And so then you get there, and then who do you ask to be on your board, or who gets to be on a board? Other people who are like you. So I think that there is a bias of the people who are in the room, and that's by design, and it's largely a good thing, of people who are more comfortable with risk than the average person.
Alphas.
Yeah, totally. Right. Yeah. So I think you have to correct for that enough. You have to structurally correct for that. You have to understand that kind of risk psychology, and you have to have sort of like your red teams in place who are there, or your in-house devil's advocate who's saying that, yeah, but what if it doesn't work?
What's a red team?
Like somebody who you're paying to come in, it's a military term, right? So you're paying a red team to come in, and they're being your attackers, right? Like you're kind of like your
like
friendly
a white
hacker,
hack, like a white hacker? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So a professional pessimist.
Yes.
A professional critic. Okay.
Yes, you have. Okay. So this is where you get into chief risk officers, chief security officers. But the thing is, you have to listen to them, right? You have to prioritize listening to them, and you have to build that in structurally. And you have to have thought through like what you're going to be in a crisis. Are you a good crisis leader? So I did, when I was at DRI, I had a great research partnership with Harvard's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, and we wanted to figure out some lessons learned from COVID-19. So we reached out to different organizations and figured out what they did in those early days. And this is a great example of like companies that are highly regulated and very large. They have whole teams, they have whole processes that are built in to be like, when we have a pandemic, this is what we're going to do. This is what we learned from the last time, and here's what we do. And there were companies, quite large companies, who either had nothing in place. The calls we got, I was like, wow. Or they were like, this is a really big one. This is the real one. I have to handle it. Only I can fix this, right? That kind of thinking. So then the C-suite just like brushed aside everyone that they had put in place to help them through it. So I think as a leader, you have to, first of all, understand that this is probably going to be a blind spot for you. You have to understand who on your team is going to be able to think in this way, and then you have to empower them to do their job effectively. Doesn't mean you have to listen to them all the time, but I think time and budget are a really good key here. Like, how often do you meet with your COO? All the time, right? Like, they're on speed dial constantly. How often do you meet with your CFO? A few times a week. How often do you meet with your chief security officer? Do you ever want to meet with your chief security officer? Probably not.
They're usually so boring.
I know, because they're the risk people. Like, they are risk averse. They are the opposite of you. But again, this is where you have to like think systematically and correct for your blind spots.
They make your life extraordinarily difficult. Like, they keep telling you not to bring certain devices into certain countries.
Yes, it is true. It is true. Yeah. But I like to bring up an example of a CEO I know of a big company, and he had he was trying to pay attention to this, and making sure that everyone had to change their passwords monthly and have two-factor authentication, all the good basic cyber hygiene that keeps out like a large majority of the bad actors within these systems, which of course are under attack all the time. Good basics. And after a while, like a few quarters went by, and he's like, I don't think I've been getting those emails. And so he called the chief information security officer into his office and was like, I thought I authorized that program. Like, why am I not getting those? And they were like, oh, but you're the CEO. We didn't want to bother with you with that, so we disabled it for you. The most high-value target in the company is the CEO. That's one thing, right? So like, this is a high-value target who you're no longer protecting, point one. Point two, like, they're the leader. They're supposed to model good behavior. If you make an exception for them, what does that say to the rank and file about your priorities and about your leadership style, it's not very effective. And during a crisis, you want to make sure that the leader is going to get in there. I mean, I think obviously the military does this very well. The incident command structures come from the military, understanding how to lead in a crisis, and everyone could do with understanding those skills a little bit more.
How do you contend with, so that obviously makes sense, and anyone who's in a position of authority and has people responsible, and I mean, not just a business leader, but like as a father, like I think about my family and how I would respond in that situation. But there's this other kind of thought process of, well, some of these potential risks are so massive that if they were to occur, there's just no point in planning for them, because how could you plan for something? So I'll give you an example. So my mother, she's pushing 90, and she just now got into online banking. Like after 40 years, she fought it for 40. She moved from credit union to credit union. Finally, even the credit unions were like, so I got her to Bank of America. And the other day she called me because I guess she saw something on Fox News that said Bank of America is going down. And she called me in a panic, and she was like, John, what do we do? And I was in Dubai. And I was like, Mom, I don't think it's going down. But if it does go down, Mom, it doesn't matter, because we're all going to be pitchforking each other. And I'm not surviving. Yeah. I mean, I'll last maybe 24 hours. Then, like, Alex will use me for food. Like, I mean, so, like, I'm aware of my limitations.
Yeah.
And so there's this element of, like, I want to prepare for certain risks, but then there are these massive risks where it feels overwhelming and exhausting at a personal and professional level to even think about. How do you get over that thinking? First of all, is that completely irrational?
John, you're already proving my point about like the C-suite being someone who's like, only I can fix this, right? Like it's so big that I have to come in and do it.
That. I got nothing.
No.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Like if I don't have room service, I'm useless. Like I have no skills. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I thought you were a plumber.
Yeah, but in an apocalypse, you're gonna care.
Plumbing is very important. I mean, yeah.
Plumbing. By the way, your toilet's everywhere. If the world ends, you won't worry about that.
So there's a few things. One is that the act of planning is what prepares you, right? Like, so the plans themselves are not important. It's the planning that is essential, and that is what's going to help you develop the skills that you need and the mindset in order to deal with crisis calmly. There was a fun study a few years ago that said that those people who'd thought through what they would do in a zombie apocalypse are more effective in an actual crisis. And it is because you've thought through, like, okay, do I have, the supplies that I need? Like, how would I get in touch with my family? Like, the kind of basic personal preparedness, doomsday prepper kind of stuff, right?
Okay.
The same thing will apply to organizations, right? Like, you'll know who to call. The basics are going to be there, and the structures are going to be there. And if you've tested and exercised, you've at least started to develop some of those skills with some of the right people. There's always the problem of, like, as well, if you're saying, like, you're overly reliant on sort of like the crisis team or the person who's really good in a crisis. So, like, if I were to come in and consult with that company, the first thing I would do in an exercise is kill that person, right? Like, they were in a plane that went down. Now what do you do, right? Because there is a tendency to be like, oh, that guy's in charge. He'll be great. In a crisis, we'll just listen to
So
Joe.
Every international flight I go on, I play a little game. I pick the person I'm going to eat. I always do. I always look around the plane.
Fun.
I'm like, if we go down, I'm like, yeah. It's not who you would think. It's not the biggest person necessarily. It's like there's a lot of factors that go into this. That's my little game I play. I'm curious. Who here?
Actually,
you're looking like tasty there, Richard.
I'm actually fascinated by, like, wait, before you get into that. Yeah. So, like, in the whaling ships, like 19th century.
Yeah.
Did you ever read, like, The Heart of the Sea?
Yes.
So this is where they've gone deep into, like, how they selected who to eat.
I don't remember that. What was that part of the book?
They were surviving in the Pacific, drifting in the Pacific Ocean.
How'd they choose?
Well, they ate the black people first, of course, and then.
That's a bummer. I didn't want that answer. Okay, we're gonna scratch that from the tape.
It's pretty awful, but it's
kind
of
like
what you would expect.
Nope, I don't support that at all.
No.
Oh man, that threw me off.
No.
That was a fun conversation until that came up.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
it was
Who
the
here? Yeah, you're right. Who here thinks they could survive no electricity for a week in New York City? Be honest. Who here thinks they could survive?
In New York City.
How are you not raised? You're the only person I think could actually survive it.
You're like Hurricane Sandy.
Really?
Think about it.
No electricity for an entire week in New York City? I mean, I survive. I'm not sorry, a month. Who thinks they can survive a month? Who has a go bag? Who actually has like a plan if like the real zombie apocalypse would happen? Okay, about a third. Like a real plan? Like you think? Okay, you obviously do. But so one more time, raise your hand. If you have a real plan, if the shit really hits the fan. Okay, only about a third.
Directions to like the middle of nowhere cottage that my family has to how to get there by like
And you'll be able to get there if the bridges are shut and everything like you. Okay. All right. About a third of people think that if remember, do you remember when there were rumors that the U.S. Army was going to shut Manhattan down to protect it against from COVID
They
from
weren't
seeping
just
out?
rumors. It was being actively considered.
All right, and so we would have been, okay, so about a third of us think that they could survive. Now, I want to ask you, as the expert, honestly, without knowing anyone here, of those third, just your gut, based on what you know, and this, I'm pointing to former Navy SEAL, expert, how many do you think could actually pull it off on a percentage basis?
Survive?
Yeah. Be honest, civilians who think they're ready, what percentage make it? Okay. Yeah, I think you're right.
Actually be able to execute on their plans.
Yeah.
And it might not be because they physically don't have or mentally have the capability. It's just environmentals you can't control.
Well, here's really what it is. It's guys like you who, if we get into a competitive state, are going to win. I don't care how much because that's been your life. You've prepped for this by the course of just actions you've chosen to take your life. I could start preparing today and be really dedicated in my spare time, and I'm not going to win if we go into competition. So my question is, since it is only 5%, again, it's still better to prepare though, even though it's somewhat useless.
So only a third of people in this room raise their hands, right? It would be better if we would have better odds if it was 100% people. 100%
5% of us could
room.
repopulate the
right. So the percentage might go up. There's a great book about this that I would recommend. It's from a few years ago called Lights Out by Ted Koppel that looked at if the grid was taken out, how long would it take for us to descend into chaos? And the answer was about a week. And basically only the Mormons are surviving because they have systems in place to kind of.
I think the Amish would do well too.
The Amish would probably do all right. Yeah, but they're pacifists. Mormons have guns.
So that's what they want you to believe.
No, they are.
You sure? I would
Yes.
lull everyone into a false sense of security and then just break out my wooden torches.
My family's background, despite being Serbian and from the Balkans, we are sort of akin to the Amish. So pretty certain. Pacifism.
Okay. So good resiliency, but bad military skills. Okay, fair enough. All right.
Yeah,
Let's finish this portion, and then we'll go to Q&A. And we kind of segued into this, but what, I know you deal mostly with governments and institutions, but what sort of lessons can individuals, what can we kind of take from the way countries and governments and companies think about large-scale crises?
Well,
so think about it.
Yeah, think about it, right?
Okay. Have a plan. Even though it's probably
what
not
I
gonna
did in the
succeed.
early days of COVID is, yes, I left before they were when the rumor of the bridges being shut down, I was like, get out of the city.
You
Definitely.
took off?
Yeah,
Okay.
took off.
Yeah.
Went to the Berkshires. Bought day-old chickens because I was like, supply chain problems, eggs.
Wait, like live
gonna be a
chickens?
problem.
Or?
Yeah, I raised chickens. Don't I look like a person who raises chickens?
Absolutely. You scream. Those heels scream chicken farmer.
I know. And I planted a vegetable garden. So I went not full on
Really?
doomsday prepper, but I went with it. Yeah.
You brought a gun? You had a gun?
I didn't have a gun. I needed a gun.
Because I feel like if you don't have a
so that
gun,
helped.
you're just aggregating resources for those with
But
guns.
at that time, gun
right?
sales
You're just
were-
if I have the gun, I'm like, thank you so much for all these chickens and all
No, you
and
are-
these
you are
vegetables.
100% right.
And
So
maybe
this
I'll
is the flaw in
force
my
you to
plan.
continue to tend for them for a while. Right? I mean, right? I mean, no? Right? Yeah.
No, it's absolutely true. But so when you think about when you think about the Department of Homeland Security saying we're in a civil defense posture, what does that actually mean? It means that we all have a stake in our preparedness as civilians. And we've been very spoiled for a very long time. I think still in the American psyche, there is this idea that our oceans protect us. We are in a hyper-connected world. Our oceans do not protect us anymore, right? So we do all have a stake in our own preparedness. And if you look at all of these hurricanes, right, the first thing that happens is a first responder is not going to be a professional. It is going to be you, your family, a neighbor, a friend, a colleague is going to be there first. And so do you want that person to have basic CPR skills and training? Do you want that person to understand the basics of what to do in a crisis? You should be thinking about in the event of a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, whatever it is, a lot of the effects are the same. You can think through the effects and do effects-based planning. And you should think how can I get to 36 hours? That's a good marker. That's something we can plan for, getting to 36 hours of preparedness. If you live in rural Idaho, it's got to be longer than that. Beyond that, then we're really, truly, truly screwed. So as a nation, but if you can get yourself to 36 hours, that's a very plausible situation. And I know that certainly the climate is changing. We're seeing more extreme storms, and you might think like, when I bought my condo, I was like, okay, highest point in Brooklyn. That's great. I'm not in a floodplain, but extreme rainfall, we're seeing flooding. We saw the basement apartments flood, for example. A lot of this is changing in ways that impact our systems, which are already, our infrastructure is crumbling. The relationship between long-term resilience and infrastructure is a fraught one, and we've been underinvesting in our infrastructure for a very long time, and that is something that really impacts all of us.
And then obviously there's potential cybersecurity attacks, there's artificial intelligence attacks. I mean, I remember the one time I testified in front of Congress was when we were trying to build an exchange with the government of the UAE for trading crude oil. And the congressional committee asked me, well, aren't you concerned about a potential adversary, putting aside whether they're an adversary or not, are you concerned with a potential adversary kind of having semi-control over, Sam knows this, over the pricing mechanism for crude oil? And our argument was, well, wait a second, if they want to screw with prices of crude oil, this is the worst decision to make because they're our partner and we get to see what's going on. They could set up a hedge fund in the BVI, put $10 billion into it, and 5 minutes before the close of the crude oil market, just short the hell out of all the futures, and that would cause temporary Armageddon.
Right.
And we've seen that with flash crashes and other things.
Yeah.
So this notion of we're safe if we don't partner with them, it may be that we're not safe if we do, but we're certainly not safe if we don't. And that's increasingly becoming the reality because we now have, we have the capital bases of some of these potential adversaries of ours are infinitely larger than ours, and they can attack us financially and other ways. Okay.
I don't like that as an argument against preparedness, that we still do need to work on preparing our systems, our nation, and ourselves.
100%. Why don't we do some Q&A now?
Yeah, John, before,
Yeah.
can I ask you a question on the preparedness? People are going to laugh and think I'm making this sort of joke. It's not. Where do you come out on the preparedness with sort of having, weapons and the ability to protect yourself?
I think it depends how good you are with them and where you live, right? Like, the person who brings a knife to a knife fight and doesn't know how to use it is probably the person who's going to get hurt. I think that's true with weapons as well in general. Certainly in an urban environment, having a lot of weapons around is not something that I really appreciate. But when you're way out in the middle of nowhere, you need to be able to defend yourself and take care of yourself. So I think it all depends on your circumstances and your abilities.
I think most of the people in rural America, and maybe even the cities, I think most people that own weapons are actually trained and do train. That are probably not being trained are people.
I would like to hope.
Well, you have to go through training, and most people I know. I grew up in Connecticut, but I lived in Texas. I was around the military. That was part of their life. You grow up with a gun. You train. You're safe. I feel safer around those people than anyone with a weapon, because they know how to handle it. And so I don't think I agree with you on the timing. I think 3 weeks you're done. And by the way, I want weapons, because people are going to be coming for you. They're just going to. It's going to be total chaos. And if you think they're not, I think you'll be coming to my house because I have weapons.
But you can also get into a state in which you're constantly thinking about the worst case scenario and thinking defensively in that way. I also have a lot of friends in the military. I've had friends who have committed suicide who are in the military because they have easy access to weapons. So I think it's a complicated issue.
Totally
right?
different. That's
not
way
a
off.
totally different
It is
issue,
because we're talking about survival in a Armageddon situation versus people who are suffering from mental PTSD from combat. I think that's quite different.
I was just saying in terms of yes, it's ability to use them, right, and ownership of them.
So, John, you would loosen gun laws in New York City?
Absolutely. The gun laws in New York City are unconstitutional. They will be loosened, so it's not a matter of time. It will. Absolutely.
Okay.
John, the only people who have guns in New York are the criminals and the cops, which are somewhat criminals sometimes.
I prefer words. If the apocalypse happens, I'm just going to belittle and riddle with sarcasm anyone that tries to
say what they
comfort me.
want. I'm not trying to. I'm just saying, when you talk about preparedness, I don't think you can have that conversation without all of it. I just don't. I think it's got to include that. I think people are being naive to think that that's not part of it.
So one interesting one that's there are random preparedness topics everywhere, and I was recently talking about wildfires out west because FEMA, they're concerned about how you deal with this. It's such a difficult crisis to deal with. It's not like hurricanes that tell you that they're coming, right? They just spark and they go. And AI is helping in terms of detection, AI-enabled drones to be able to detect them, something like that. But in the state of Idaho, like the majority of people own a horse, and they're not going to evacuate without their horse, right? So like there are unique conditions everywhere in terms of like how you're dealing with crisis and all of the different aspects of it. Like, so everyone in every situation in every system is going to react differently, but like dealing with a crisis in Idaho is also dealing with like what are you going to do to house all of those horses, for example. So like every crisis response is unique.
What's the people in Florida's excuse? Because they don't leave
Floridians
either.
are pretty well prepared
Right.
for hurricanes.
Right.
I mean, they know this, that, you know, like
They're just used to it.
this is their thing.
Want to jump in on a question? We got the mic over here.
So Sam first.
Hi, it's Sam first. No, Sam Gare. As John mentioned, I worked with John many years ago. One of the things that I was in charge of at New York Mercantile Exchange was disaster recovery. I testified in front of Congress about it. And so I'm certainly dating myself now, so please forgive me. So in after 9/11, NYMEX, New York Mercantile Exchange, NYMEX basically constructed a literal replica trading floor in, of all places, for disaster recovery, Long Island.
Yeah.
If you remember, in 2003, there was a big blackout, right? But prior to that, between 9/11 and 2003, there was a big push for disaster recovery, specifically in the wake of the World Trade Center imploding. What we found in 2003, after all of that and industry testing, et cetera, the blackout occurred. We broke out the cots. It was a very physically centered disaster recovery solution. We broke out the cots. We were ready to go. And NYMEX was ready to clear and trade within hours. Blackout, everything's down, let's go. We got phone calls, and I am actually not kidding you, from one of the largest investment banks, and I'm not going to mention their names, but it starts with a G. And they called us from a payphone saying that we're not ready, please don't open up the markets. The point is that disaster
They're much
recovery...
more prepared these days.
I'm sorry?
They're much more prepared these days.
I'm sure they are, especially after this, because...
Are they your client? Is that why you're saying that?
No, they actually were like, they were, yes.
The
but
point
that's
is
another
that,
story.
the point is that disaster recovery is not sexy. It's not revenue generating. It's an expense.
Yeah.
In the context of shareholder value, stock price, et cetera, it's really not something that folks are really stressing, right?
Yeah.
So how in today's world with internet, COVID, et cetera, how do you get firms to say, hey, this is a real priority, we're going to commit to this, we're going to test to this, and we're going to be ready?
They are a lot more than they used to be, certainly than those days. And I thought you were going to talk about Y2K, because that was like an interesting one where it was
Not
like...
that old. I was around.
It
I'm
was
not
a
that
couple
old.
years before, come on. But like with Y2K, it was one of those like, sometimes preparedness, especially if it works, can just look like a cost, and like we over-prepared, we wasted money, and so that's something to be aware of, right? But I hear a lot less pushback these days, especially after COVID, especially after supply chain incident. After a supply chain incident, 2020 was a super active hurricane year, 2017, and we have the wildfires all the time. We have all of the impact of regulation, climate-related financial disclosure, energy transition. There's just endless disruption all the time. And so I just don't hear quite the level of pushback that I know what you're talking about. And sometimes it's the messaging as well.
What I've noticed
Yeah.
specifically in the in the industry in futures and securities, there used to be these quarterly disaster recovery tests, and everybody is gearing up, and it's a Saturday, and we roll the systems. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, it doesn't happen in the same way, but you're still doing tabletops. You're still doing different kinds of exercises. The same way you don't have like cold sites and hot sites anymore. Because of COVID, it was like, okay, now we do the work from home strategy, which has its own vulnerabilities as well. Because you disperse the population.
We experienced
right?
it today with Zoom, as
But
John saw.
it's a very fair point. When was the last time you heard? When was the last time that person who always everyone has a person who sends them stock tips? When was the last time that person called you and said, "You got to buy this stock. It's going to go up because they're really well prepared"? right?
Yeah.
When have you heard that from an analyst? When has it ever been a topic of conversation, right? It's not. It's a
But
fair
when
point.
they don't build in resilience and they have
go
a
to zero.
massive
Yep.
crisis, that's when they have the problem. And so that's usually when either it's after a crisis, that's a big moment of opportunity, whether it's for that particular company or for their competitors who are like, oh gosh, I don't want that to happen to me. Like the Target hack. Does anyone know what the largest hack ever was in terms of number of users compromised?
CrowdStrike?
CrowdStrike is a good guess. It wasn't CrowdStrike. That's also a good guess. It wasn't Equifax. Nobody has ever guessed it ever. Yeah? Ashley Madison is on the list, but it's not the biggest. But it's a fun one to have come up. It's
I don't know what that is.
Yahoo.
What do you mean? Ashley?
Yahoo.
Ashley, what is
Everyone
that?
always forgets about Yahoo.
Yahoo, that was the biggest one?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was huge.
Okay. But on that topic, so like, who here, like, I sign up for all these like these services that tell me when I've been hacked.
Yeah.
And the first
like
couple
all
of
the
times
time.
I felt concerned.
Yeah.
Now it's almost like comical. It's
Yeah.
like, you know, a billion
Yeah.
here, a billion there, and so it loses its effectiveness because it just seems like, well, who cares? It's already all out there.
Yeah, and on some level, it's a systemic problem, right? Like this has to be dealt with at the organizational level, and in some ways, it is being. Then there's the basics of cyber hygiene will generally keep you okay, and freezing your credit obviously is really important.
Freezing your credit, right? If something
Unless you're
happens.
actively going to use it, yeah, I think keeping it frozen is generally a good.
Wait, so you mean just in general?
Yeah.
Just having it always frozen.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it a pain to unfreeze it?
No, I mean it's a call, right? But like,
Yeah.
it's not that big of a pain. I guess you don't have your credit frozen.
I do not have my credit frozen. No. No.
You know,
Yeah.
before you were talking about
You gotta say who you are.
I'm Richard Stanton.
Yep. Right.
What you would do in the middle of a crisis
Yeah.
moment.
Other than raise
and
chickens.
How you would act. I mean, you're talking about COVID, which took time. I
Yeah.
know time. But I had a surreal, and so do a lot of people in this room that they don't remember. I was on the west side, walking over to the east side in 2001.
Yeah.
It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon as the buildings were going down.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget this. It was really surreal. You're walking across the west side. There is not a car on the road.
Yeah.
There are planes flying over New York. You're walking because you can't, and I'm walking from the west side to the east side. It was like deserted.
Yeah.
And for like 2 or 3 hours, you're in a fog. I mean, it's like you no matter how tough you were, you were in like a blur.
Yeah.
Because you were in that moment of not knowing what was going on and not knowing, do you go right, left, back, forth? You just didn't know. So we all probably lived that. Everyone in this room
Yeah.
has where they were. You know, I'm not talking in the beginning. At 4 o'clock, when you went out and you saw what was going on,
Yep.
and planes and this, it was like a war zone because
Right.
people were worried they were coming over, they were going to be attacked. So that was an immediate crisis moment where you thought about it for like really 3-4 hours, and no matter where you were, you panicked.
Yeah.
I want to put you on the spot for a second. So because what he's talking about is a natural reaction to an adverse event, a massive adverse event that we've never trained for, we've never prepared for, right? And everybody effectively shock. So you're a Navy SEAL. You receive training in how to overcome, and that's a natural human instinct, right? It's if you've never seen someone shot, the first time you see someone shot, which I haven't, I'm sure I'd react. I'd freak out. How? I mean, I'm asking you to kind of summarize all your years of training into a soundbite, but are there ways that we can think about preparing ourselves for what seems to be unpreparable?
In that context, and like exercising your sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous system, I think is one point. So if you expose yourself to like stress inoculated situations and try to put yourself through thinking circumstances, that's helpful. And over time, you're able to kind of regulate your system so that you can still maintain that.
So expand on that. So you're saying like baby step into the
So anytime
event?
you're exposed to like stress, right, you like hit kind of different part of your brain and your nervous system, right? So you want to maintain that prefrontal cortex control and think logically and think clearly. It's really hard to do in a stress inoculated environment. So over time, how they train us is really to make decisions in those types of environments, gather information, process information.
You're conditioned for it.
Right, and remain, well, not, yeah, like naturally we're not, right? So like the first time you get shot at, the second time you get shot at, it gets a little bit more calm, and then before you know it, you're
Right.
a veteran and you're It takes practice. It's like the
Right.
first time you got punched in the face that you're a boxer.
Yeah.
Right? And then you gradually just become more aware.
I still don't like it. I'm not gonna lie. I still really don't like it. It's happened a bunch, and I don't enjoy it at all.
I've done a lot of work with the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and different kind of international policy conversations about trying to take care of people who are not trained, right? Like in consequence management, in emergency management. And so like if you think about something like tsunamis, right? Like when you can train the population, right? Like there are national drills in Japan, tests and exercises about earthquakes, about tsunamis. They train the population. But what about all the visitors? What about all the tourists? What about all the people who don't speak Japanese, right? Like, what do you do with them? And so has to be a lot of thoughtful planning there. There's also an issue, which is a big issue in a country like ours, which is that like, even if you've been speaking English for your entire adult life for like 40 years, in that moment of panic, when you're in that haze, you might forget your English if your first language is another language. And so you have to keep the communications as simple as possible so that people can understand like the basics. So when it comes with like a tsunami, it's like there's all over Japan now the pictures of like a wave and an arrow being like, wave, go that way, right? Like you have to keep it as simple as possible, as nonverbal as possible to deal with people whose brains aren't functioning effectively, because that is definitely something that you have to plan for and expect in a crisis.
People that basically conditioned just normal growing up, that were conditioned just to normally deal with stress. In fact, they thrive on it.
Yeah.
They'll condition themselves to lose when they're up,
Yeah.
so they
Right.
can have problems, so they can solve.
Richard, one second. Sorry, Stan. We got you.
Hey, it's Stan. Hi. And actually, I wanted to step a little away from the apocalypse situation, especially when we're dealing, like when you mentioned the Baltimore, basically bridge going down. Like, what subsequent events? And the reason I ask is basically, like, you know, for those who don't know me, I originally built a recycling blockchain that's evolved to a supply chain visibility platform that obviously now we have supply chain visibility. Now we can start layering on data to understand basically levers and choke points and bottlenecks in the supply chain according to geopolitical events, economic events, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, especially climate. So we're building the models right now to basically assign intensity, especially lead times to like effects in the supply chain, because there is a direct economic impact to companies involved who are linked in the supply chain. So going back to Baltimore, obviously a non-apocalyptic situation, for me personally, all right, it happened in March. Did any of the predictions that you wrote about come to pass, and why or why not did it, and how? Essentially, I look at the supply chain and especially infrastructure, everything like that. There's excess capacity and resilience in what we have so far, and how far and how much can we stress that system before those impacts actually come to pass?
Great question. First of all, really exciting the work that you're doing in supply chain tracing. It's a huge issue. I mean, when I talk to companies, like supply chain management, so complex. They might understand they're like tier 1 suppliers, but the further up the supply chain you go, it's a total mystery. And they're all very reliant on smaller and smaller
We might
numbers.
have a solution. So
yeah, so really cool. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in that space, and it's really important work. In terms of the predictions, so there is still a lot of stress in the supply chain. You still have that port. That port was blocked for quite a while, and the bridge has to be rebuilt. So it's not just the port was reopened relatively quickly. They were able to move the ship. It was like a month and a half, 2 months, something like that. I don't know. I did another BBC interview at that day. I think it was 2 months. But the corridor is still down, and that was an important trucking corridor along I-95. Who's travel on I-95? It's terrible. It's always traffic. There's tons of trucks. It's a really important artery for moving goods, for moving freight through the U.S. So that creates the kind of ripple effect strain that leads to persistent inflation. So even though we've gotten a handle on it, it just adds another layer of stress. There's another area where it's more brittle. And yes, during COVID, we did build in more resilience. There's been less focus on just-in-time supply chains. There's more idea of like, let's diversify. Let's make sure we don't have sole source or single source suppliers. We need a variety of areas and from friendly countries and this and that. All of that is expensive. It just is. And so I got a lot of panic calls during the port strike that was happening while the Hurricane Helene recovery was happening from like Fox Business News or whatever, saying like, okay, so is this going to cause problems with, you know, the disaster response and getting supplies to people? Because again, a lot of what's coming in through those ports are finished goods that are required if people's homes have just been destroyed and they need, you know, to go to Walmart and Home Depot and IKEA, which were some of the top brands that would have been affected by that port strike should it linger. That would cause prolonged problems. So companies have gotten better at dealing with this, and yet to your point, asking me about the poly crisis, it just keeps happening, right? Like, so this is all within a few years. So I think companies are adjusting, but it just means more expense.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, I do feel like access to data and actually using that data. For example, like the labor strike that just happened across the East Coast, right? My models were actually predicting it wasn't going to last that long just because the labor union doesn't have that much in their budget to basically pay the wages for more than a week or two. So they needed to.
The longshoreman strike or which
Exactly
Yeah,
right, the
close down the
longshoreman
ports.
strike. So their bank coffers actually didn't allow them to strike more than 2 weeks.
Interesting.
I didn't, it was funny because NBC News did an interview with me, and then before they could publish it, the strike was called off. And I was like, but then she published the article anyway. She just like changed the angle. I was like, interesting, okay.
They went after the head of that union really hard. Remember how they published pictures of his house and his massive house and his Bentley and all of that? Actually, my father was a longshoreman. That was the first job I ever had, was helping him on the dock. Yep. When I heard that they were striking, I remember thinking like these are very resilient, and by resilient I mean hard-headed individuals who believe they've struck the jackpot with these great union jobs that pay. I mean, my father's been retired for 30 years. He still gets a full pension. Like, how many people you know that have that? They have an amazing deal. That's interesting. That's what you okay, Louis.
Thank you. Chloe spoken incredibly eloquently about different aspects of how.
So, Louis Cohen, attorney. Yep.
Attorney.
Yep.
Thank you.
We'll forgive you.
Supply chain.
He's a lawyer. They make themselves heard. Just yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please, for the recording. Yeah, can we get him the mic? Yeah. If he repeats himself, it becomes billable.
There you go. Attorney. Chloe, you've spoken so eloquently about the supply chain, and on the one hand, and dealing with that, and on the other hand, sort of the ultimate sort of transaction. Somebody comes with a gun and takes your chickens. What happens? I'm really curious. For a number of us here are interested in crypto as a payment method. How do people transact in some of these disaster scenarios where you don't have perhaps access to your funds? You have your payment app. Where's my Bluetooth? It's not working. I don't have any cash. Most of us probably, who has more than a few dollars in a wallet, paper money? Crypto is not going to work without the internet. How do you think about that kind of transacting on a very basic basis?
Yeah, you're not going to like my answer, right? Which is cash. Like actually having cash, making sure that you do have cash. It's sort of like the good personal preparedness of like, make sure you fill your gas tank, make sure you withdraw some cash. There was an interesting case study from a bank in Brazil that was operating in a town that had an earthquake and then some mudslides. And the local branch of the bank decided to allow cash withdrawals on an honor system because they didn't have access to any of their records and the ATMs didn't work. And without access to cash, people couldn't recover. They couldn't buy the basic things that they needed. And so they literally would like show their bank card and say like, I need this much amount of money. And it was capped at a certain amount. And the level of fraud was like almost none. People were really, really grateful about that happening. But we're still in that environment of like, your phone's not going to work, right? Like, how many people have a transistor radio or like ham radio, right? Like, it's not something that people do. Do you? I saw
But
an expression.
I
right?
stand by my thesis
it's
that,
true.
that
Yeah.
the environment you're describing, there's still rule of law. If the rule of law breaks down, then cash is irrelevant because gun beats cash. If I have
Yes.
gun, I have your cash.
Correct.
And whether we move to a system of barter or whatnot. But by the way, how dare you say that our magical internet money is not going to be relevant in the apocalypse? But I will say this: being in crypto, I do find it funny when I meet like crypto anarchists who think the apocalypse is coming, because in that scenario, the people I actually respect are the doomsday preppers. Like I think they're nuts. I watch the show and I laugh at them, but they're consistent. Because if you really believe we're heading there, then you're not buying Bitcoin. You're buying seeds, barbed wire, land. You're forming a militia of like-minded people that you can trust. I have no militia. Do you have a militia? You have a militia?
Unfortified, but
Yeah, you have like a WhatsApp militia. Like you have the guys who like the shit goes down, you're gonna like hit each other up. Yeah, I have a group that just trades memes, like useless, absolutely useless.
Does anybody remember that
Okay.
that movie, The Empire of the Sun? There's like that wonderful image of like the paintings and the expensive goods that are worth nothing during wartime, during time of famine. It's true.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
Anne Marie.
it is. Yeah.
I'm Anne-Marie. I was a lawyer for a long time. Now I do strategy to try to solve problems. And so first, I've learned tonight never to get on an international flight with my friend John, because I don't want to know who he picks. That's terrifying. So I have been the general counsel of multiple regulated businesses as part of my career, and I thought about what Sam said. I've been the general counsel of multiple broker-dealers, and we've always had to have business continuity plans. And in multiple aspects, you had to have, and you'll appreciate this, and John, you will too, you had to have remote locations. And so 9/11, we had to have remote location, but nobody could get to the remote location because we were locked in New York City for several days. And then Sandy hit, and all of the remote locations were washed out. So you couldn't get to the remote location, and lots of us lost our homes. And so that didn't work. And then COVID hit, and nobody could get remote location. So I wonder, all of these different huge risks to businesses have morphed from physical terrorist attacks to natural disasters to pandemics. How do companies actually put risk plans in place that are flexible enough to deal with what we're dealing with? Because you never know what it's going to be, right? Nobody expected. I lived in New York City on 9/11. It's what made me move out of New York City to New Jersey, because the idea of being trapped someplace where you could not leave.
You'd rather be trapped in New Jersey?
No, I'm not trapped. I'm
I
not,
couldn't
I
help it
have
as
a
a New
garden.
Yorker.
I have a garden. I plant stuff. I have access to fruit and veg. I can.
Any chickens?
I don't. I have a dog, but she could
Consider it.
hunt a squirrel if she had to. She's very vicious. But I have. That's part of what made me want to be more prepared, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm just curious, like, how do we prepare when you don't know what it's going to be,
Yeah,
right?
It's a great question, and certainly the kind of the offsite planning, hot sites, cold sites, warm sites, whatever, was something that was very popular when we all thought, oh, you have to come in physically to the office to be there and plan for that, and then they were all kind of like close by, so they moved them further out after 9/11, and I think that strategy has been demonstrated that like it works in very specific circumstances, but other than that, it's not that useful. The work from home workaround is better, unless of course we have total internet shutdown, but it's more effective than having a backup site at this point. So it does change. It's not that like the strategies aren't going to change over time. Of course, they're going to have to change over time and we're going to have to think about like the ways in which our systems change, technology changes, and revisit that all the time. One funny story from COVID is somebody who just taken over as COO of a large insurance company and was like, yeah, business continuity is going to be like 10% of my job. And then like COVID happened 2 months later and it was like her whole job.
Yeah.
And they were like, okay, send everybody to work from home. Well, this is stodgy insurance. They're like used to having people in the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5. They issued desktops to everybody, like the heavy, clunky ones with like the big thing underneath. I don't even know what that thing is called, right? Like I'm from a laptop generation. And so they had the problem of like not being able to get them to their people kitted out with what they needed. So they had to figure out how to get laptops at a time when we were having supply chain issues to get those to people. But that's the kind of thing that you could have thought about if you were thinking about it, right? Like, so, but then there's also the risk of like going too far into the future and being overly reliant on kind of the next latest, greatest thing that hasn't been tried and tested, because it's the old tried and tested stuff that's probably going to work in a crisis. So like with anything else, it's a balancing act.
You're also bringing up a really interesting point about how these big pandemics and crises, they change our behaviors. They change your behavior. You were a city person, and then you became a quasi-country person. I'm curious, who thinks like they've fundamentally changed since COVID? Like has COVID changed who they are, like on a fundamental basis? Like a lot of nods, like probably learned new, like sourdough bread, right? I'm sure we all know sourdough bread. No, but I'm reminded of a long time ago, a while ago, I was on a panel, and there were CIOs of pension funds. And the pension fund guy from New Orleans made an offhanded comment that 99% of their pensioners got electronic banking. They would send them their pension payment electronically. And the other pension CIOs were like, oh, that's amazing. I wish we have all these old biddies who would never, ever use electronic banking. They want their paper check. And the guy got really quiet, and he said, well, he goes, after Hurricane Katrina, like 20% of the city just had no address. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, you'll be amazed how quickly an old biddy learns how to use the internet for banking if it's the difference between eating and not eating. And that was it. That fundamentally changed the behavior of that entire demographic quickly. So yeah, so it changes kind of who we are. Did you want to make a comment? Yeah.
I have a question, Sonia Nace. I'm asking a question from a medical perspective.
And Sonia, say what you do, because it's particularly relevant.
So I'm asking this question as a critical care trauma nurse in New York City for many, many years. I worked 9/11 down on site as well as in the hospitals.
Wow.
I also worked COVID.
Yeah.
We talk about disaster preparedness individually, but the problem we found in 9/11 was each hospital had its own disaster plan. There was no interactive plan. So is that being addressed? Are we looking at corporations and companies saying, wait a second, the hospital system is going to have to work with the communication system, with the ambulance, the fire department. All of our disaster plans need to be interactive, because it undermines our effectiveness.
Yeah.
How would you, I want to lay on that, and how would you advise companies who are competitors to think about that?
Yeah, so it's a great point. Some of that has happened, I think you'd be pleased to hear, especially after Hurricane Sandy. So in 2012, if you remember, NYU Langone had the blackout and the flooding, and they were carrying premature babies down dark stairwells, right? And the hospitals after that, there was a lot of kind of learning and understanding that we have to react not just as hospitals to be more resilient, but as New York City's hospital system. And so there is a lot more preparedness overall within the system to help each other and to work together. Hospitals are kind of unique. It's critical infrastructure, it's health infrastructure, and so even though they are competitors, they're more likely to work together. It's care profession, right? Like, yes, they are competitors, but they will get together and plan for like the big crisis. So New York City Health and Hospitals kind of governs all of that, and saw them recently, and so that is happening because of a lot of the lessons learned. Really important, probably not everywhere, but at least in New York City, that is happening. Another interesting case study that we were working at DRI the last couple of years was in the state of Maryland. They wanted to improve their resilience as a state overall, and so they brought us in to do trainings with all of their critical partners. So that's like hospitals, that's different emergency services, that's the largest employers, that's the university systems, state and local governments, to train together so that the people would know each other, right, in advance and talk through some of these issues. And so then again, because you never want, like, in the emergency management community, you're always talking about how, like, you don't want a crisis to be the time when you're trying to make an introduction. Like, hi, my name is Chloe. You want to be like, Bill, I need X, Y, and Z right now. And you know who I am, and you know where to go, where to get them, and you know to prioritize.
So that's key. So Google, Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce, pretty kind of wacky, charismatic guy. He wrote an incredible article about how he was able to procure PPE during COVID. But the reason it was interesting, it wasn't just like, I'm rich, so I can do anything. Because he says, like, the money didn't matter at that point. He goes, everyone who was rich was trying to get masks, no one could.
Yeah.
What he said it was his willingness over the years prior to develop personal relationships with people that he didn't really need. He would meet an interesting person who ran like a plastics factory in Angola. And he was, that's an interesting person. I'll stay in touch with them because who knows, I want them in my network. And it kind of reminds me of like this, what we do here. And then when the shit hit the fan and he needed to procure it, he was able to call, and because they trusted him, not just because he was Mark Benioff, because they had a personal relationship, they were you couldn't transfer money. They were giving him credit and able to then put things into production. And within weeks, he was able to procure masks and all this cool stuff. But he said it was entirely a function of his networking skills, not just his capital base.
So during COVID, when I was in my office, like shutting it down, I pulled a few books off of the shelf that I wanted to read. And one of them was The History of the Spanish Flu, The Federalist Papers, How to Survive in the Woods, and Where There Are No Doctors. So this was my reading list during the initial days of the shutdown. Didn't have the gun, but I had the right reading list. Real New Yorker here. But reading the seminal history of the Spanish flu while all this was happening was one of those, like, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure rhymes, right? Like a lot of these issues in terms of like misinformation.
Talk about doom, you were doom reading and not just doom scrolling.
But it was useful, you know, it was very informative. So, but you know, a lot of the same things kind of happened in a slightly different way that happened then, happened again. And so these things do happen again and again. But like the PPE issue is one where it's, in past crises, we've had a similar issue. And then all of these companies are like, okay, well, I'm going to ramp up production of PPE now because I'm going to make a lot of money doing that because capitalism, yay. I mean, that's the incentives, right? But then as soon as the pandemic is over, the demand is completely gone, you know, and so they stop doing it. And then enough time goes by that you have this problem again. So this is, again, an issue where it's a really great opportunity for a public-private partnership and an area where, you know, government resources do become very important to make sure that they are, for example, replenishing the national stockpile, which does exist, but like the New York City hospitals were getting PPE from the national stockpile in those early days of COVID, and it was like they were getting pediatric masks that were like expired. And I was like, masks expire? Like, what does that even mean? It means that like the elastic is brittle, right? So like it doesn't stay on your face, and it's a pediatric mask anyway. So you're asking like a nurse who's working like these crazy long shifts to like do this with a pediatric mask that she's using for 5 shifts in a row?
Yep.
Hey, I'm Alex. I'm your resident psychopath, doomsday prepper, according to John, an expert. Can you talk to us about what the next month may look like? How bad can it get, and what's the most probable path?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things is that like I was with FEMA in September talking about what are the areas of concern that we should be thinking about. And one of them was national special security events. So these are our highest ranked special security events. We only have 2 standing ones every year. Anyone want to guess what they are? Like highest level of security? Yeah, UN General Assembly is one, and there's one more.
Taylor Swift concert?
Well, the inauguration isn't every year. That should be an NSSE. State of the Union. Yeah, State of the Union, an annual event. Yeah. January 6th this year is going to be an NSSE. It was not before because who knew what it was, right? Like nobody knew that it mattered. Like nobody knew about the date. So certainly very high alert levels across the board. I think there will be enhanced security everywhere. I'm trying to be optimistic that it will be okay. Are you're certainly
what do you
preparing
think's gonna
for
happen?
doomsday, right?
Well, remaining apolitical in these conversations.
Yep.
Like, if the left wins, how will that play out from a risk perspective? And if the right wins, how would that? And how would you compare the two from a civil complex?
I think we should expect and plan for civil unrest and hope that it doesn't happen, but it certainly is going to happen, I think, no matter which way it goes. And certainly there is a lot of planning going into that, and that should extend through through Inauguration Day.
Do you think the left, like, if one side wins, do you think it would be more dangerous and it could be worse than the other, just knowing the populations?
I think it's probably, it could come from either there are more guns on one side than on the other, but there are also some really intense actors on the other side. So I think it's important to prepare for both.
I mean, I'll get you 1 second. What do you think?
I just want a deeper answer. Like, if you could, like,
Yeah.
you're obviously fascinating to hear.
Yeah.
And risk is constantly orbiting your mind. So, like, if
Yeah.
you were to like pull out a glass ball and be like, what could you?
But isn't the higher probability of a I mean, you're talking about effectively civil war. Isn't the higher probability if no side clearly wins?
If no side clearly wins.
Yeah. If there's a landslide either way, you have disaffected people, but can they really garner the anger that a very, very, very small margin of victory where there's the belief of some type of malfeasance, that seems to be what is driving it. But if one side just crushes the other, you'll have angry people, but to gather the critical mass to really cause problems, I mean, isn't that probably more, I mean, curious, any views on that? I mean, lots of nodding heads, right?
Yeah.
Sa-
I think, last year when this happened, it was a new thing, so what happened, there's no National Guard, I think they've got troops already ready in every state, that very low key.
Right.
And if something happens, they're gonna react very quickly. That's my hope, I think we're overreacting, I don't think anything's gonna happen.
And the other thing,
I hope I'm right.
and the other thing I was like, our security apparatus is pretty good at catching people conspiring at that scale.
Especially when they're hiding around the bushes of Mar-a-Lago.
It's hard. Like it would take it would take a lot of people, right? Not a few. Even a couple thousand of you is going to have trouble against the U.S. Army, right? So assuming the system is still falling in place, like I struggle to imagine our FBI and our CIA and our NSA not figuring out that like 1 million people are planning something. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but that's what makes me more comfortable that we're not going to have any mass uprising. There's going to be problems, there's no question, but a mass uprising, what it would take to get 1 million people behind a cause in this country now, you think that's a real risk?
I think about like proxies too, like from external threat.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yep.
It's
fair.
Stir shit up really quickly from external proxies. So like, are we most vulnerable at this
Yeah.
point in time where?
I mean, the London riots were caused by a fake photo. I mean, we know this. Again, there may be legitimate or people believe to be legitimate underlying reasons, but the stated reason why the London riots occurred, which went on for weeks, was a doctored photo.
Yeah.
And that's the stoic British. I mean, we'd lose our minds. All right, wait, hold on. Wait, Stan, Aaron hasn't spoken yet. I'm sorry. You're next. This gentleman here, Chris. Yeah, please.
My name's
You're
Chris.
next.
I
Yeah.
live on Capitol Hill, a few blocks from the Capitol building. So this is, it's, I sort of experienced this in the mix when it happened 4 years ago. So I'm certainly thinking about that and preparing. I work in the blockchain world and focus on national security policy for blockchain crypto industry trade association. And I'm curious, sort of a follow-on to your question, Alex, given all the dynamic and sort of accelerating interconnectedness and the poly-crisis world we're in, what are the top couple of things that keep you up at night? China, devolution of their demographics and economy, that Volt Typhoon, and all these sort of overlapping conflicts and national interests.
Okay, yeah, one short term, one long term.
The thing that keeps me up at night is my son. And the other one on the way. But no, in truth, the tensions between the U.S. and China really do concern me.
What time frame are you worried about for that?
Medium term.
Okay,
A
couple years.
Couple years.
Okay.
Yeah. It's 2027. That kind of time frame. It's just like I said. It's this slow-moving crisis that just keeps boiling and feels inevitable, and it feels so hard to stop that train. That does concern me. The climate change, honestly, keeps me up at night. I'm seeing and feeling the effects, and seeing things about water issues. I mentioned Arizona and water. I'm like, geez, okay. So that sort of thing. Extreme heat has gotten a lot of attention recently, which I think is important. We're not very well equipped to deal with something like that. Think about how hot New York is. Think how warm it is today, right? Our systems aren't equipped for that sort of thing. And then when you have the wildlife-urban interface and climate change creating more options for pandemics. So that is all very concerning. On the other hand, in terms of like some of the issues that I've been talking about with FEMA are really the emerging advanced technology threats, mis and disinformation, cyber, and how we can use all of these tools to smaller actors can create all kinds of chaos that are disproportionate to what you'd think their power actually is. And so that is always concerning because humans are very predictable. We're pretty easy to stir up against each other. And we're just in a time where like, it's been a long time since World War II, right? Like people forget. That's sort of like the cycle of time in which people just forget how bad things can really be.
Yeah. Chris, can you pass that back to Aaron? While he's waiting, so I just joined MIT CCL Lab, which is their largest artificial intelligence computer science lab, and in the 2 weeks I've been an official unpaid employee of MIT, the research I'm getting has been fascinating, and one of the big things that I picked up on is hacking tools that as recently as 18 months ago were only really available to nation states or the wealthiest of hacking organizations are now couple hundred bucks in the dark web. So the ability, as you mentioned, the ability for kind of petty criminals, assuming they have the technical sophistication,
terrorists,
to wield the equivalent of a nuclear weapon from a hacking perspective 18 months ago is very, very scary. Because at least, to some degree, these very well-funded operations acted rationally.
Yeah.
Right? Nation states, to some degree, act rationally. They know if they overstep bounds, they become a potential military target.
Yeah.
Some Yahoo who's lost all hope of life, who has some technical skill because they had a computer science degree later on, we're giving them weapons of mass destruction for pennies on the dollar.
Or like a CFR was talking last week with General McChrystal was there and talking about the pager attack, right? He was saying like that's something that we could do. We wouldn't do it because of the consequences of kind of opening up the opportunity to spread that kind of behavior. And so like that sort of thing is out there now.
Right.
Are we going to see more of that? That's weaponizing supply chains for real.
Aaron.
Thanks, John. First off, excellent talk. Second off, in regards to the political insurrection component, couldn't it be more French Revolution-ish? And just
You
a
want a
bunch of
guillotine?
people. No, I'm saying just a bunch of people are upset. Like who are just like feel like they've been wronged. Right? But like and then in a different sense, actually a question is so when you think about like risk, like people plan for the last event. So you put systems in place and then demographics change, circumstances change. Give you an example, like if you put in systems for like the Spanish flu, you'd have a lot more people in that system. Even if you had a perfect system in place, as people, the population increased, it would put more strain on it.
Yeah.
So how do you
We're always
consider
fighting the last war, right?
Yeah, exactly. So how do you plan for the next battle and not the last battle, and even account for the fact that you're going to be always fighting the last battle?
Yeah. It's funny, like, we had a pandemic class at DRI that we always had. It didn't sell, right? Like, nobody bought it. I was like, I don't care about it. I think there's also, like, an innate human resistance to thinking about something like that. It's just, like, something we really don't want to think about. But there were two places where it always sold for years, so we would have to sort of maintain it, which was East Asia and the Caribbean, because they were dealing with these threats all the time. So by the time COVID rolled around, I was like, okay, we're going to sell a lot of this. Again, CEO, revenue generation, P&L, and all that. So, but looking at it, everything was influenza, right? Like, it didn't say coronavirus anywhere because none of the experts thought that, like, it was going to be a coronavirus. The big one was not going to be a coronavirus. It was going to be influenza. So I was like, okay, just change the wording real quick and we'll get this out there. So to your point about always fighting the last war, that is definitely true. So how do you do that? You do kind of scenario planning. I've been doing a lot more work with kind of like trained futurists recently, which is really fun. And I did some work recently in terms of thinking about like 2050, right? The world in 2050. So if we think about a world where climate change has continued to progress and we haven't really dealt with it. And so what does that mean? We have more and more people who are vulnerable. We already know that the majority of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. So you're one crisis away from really being a dire setback. So you have an increasing world of have and have nots, massive inequality. You have people who are in Manhattan who can kind of fence themselves off, and they can live in sort of tech-enabled smart cities, and they're basically shielded from the consequences. You have climate control, you have all of these technologies, and you're in the connected community. And then you have all of these people who are outside, who are reliant on it, You also have an eroding tax base because these people are probably unemployed. Therefore,
Due to AI, right? That's the
due to
theory.
AI,
The theory
right?
is
or,
that
or whatever,
right?
robotics, right? Aging populations, and so you have a problem like that. And then what happens in a crisis like that? Let's think about, the crisis we were looking at the time was if you had a terrorist attack on major distribution hubs, so Indianapolis, Chicago, Memphis, right? You take those down, you ground all the planes, you have like FedEx, Amazon warehouses, like can't deliver anything. And then you have all of these like protected populations who are dependent on those kind of like drone-enabled deliveries, last mile kind of stuff. But like all of the blue-collar workers have been replaced by robots, AI-enabled technologies. Like, do we even write an address on a box anymore? Probably not. It's a QR code. So if all the systems have been jammed, where's your manual override? There isn't one, right? You don't have a workforce that is going to be able to go into those warehouses to distribute that stuff. If you have driverless trucking, again, if the systems are down, none of that's going to work. There's no manual override. And then it's like and this is sort of like a different situation, but again, I think about something like as we move to more like driverless cars, let's say like the cool technology would be like facial recognition. I don't have a key. I just approach my car and it opens only for me because it knows who I am. And then it will drive me to work, right? But what if that same car, which has AI-enabled protection built in, saying like a crisis is coming, a hurricane is coming, I'm going to evacuate. My owner isn't here, I'm not opening for them, but I'm just gonna drive off. Empty, right? Owner's left, and meanwhile you have all these driverless cars empty, blocking up roads, protecting.
There's a Stephen King movie about them going motorists. Remember that? What was that? Remember that movie with Stephen King's all the cars went crazy, started to kill people? Right? But no, Cujo was the dog. No, but okay, so you're
but
Christine, you're right. So
I actually that's one way I protect myself psychologically. I don't watch disaster movies at all.
So you're less concerned. So
like no.
So it's a combination of sort of loss of skills, which I think is true.
Yep.
I grew up in a construction family, so I can actually like hang lights and do that stuff. And when people in my condo in New York found out I could do that, I get more calls than the super. No, and it's frightening because nobody can do it.
Yeah.
Nobody can change a light switch in my entire building on the Upper East Side of New York City. Like, they think it's just magic to do that. So we have a loss of skills. We have over-reliance on highly complex systems that could potentially be sabotaged.
Yep.
And then we're left just sort of all twiddling our thumbs and able to get our packages from Amazon.
And all the incentives are to continue to go along this path, right? To like go further. That's the cool technology. And we're, again, because of, like I talked about, how you get to the C-suite is not by not thinking about these worst case scenarios.
I want to end with this. I think we're going to wrap up. We're going to have cocktails. This has always bugged me about this because I hear everything you're saying, Alex. Everything you're saying, I agree with. We have these concentrated areas that are prone to attack, and it doesn't seem to be that difficult to do it. Like I remember after 9/11, like everyone just believed you would never get in the subway again. Because why would you? Because some terrorist with a backpack or one grenade could just destroy it. And of course, why doesn't that happen more? We have many, many countries, we have many people that hate us, we have mentally ill in the US. Like, I'm continually surprised by the lack of crisis event from a terrorism or crime perspective. Like, that continually baffles me. So I'm just kind of curious, like, and I think part of why I'm probably too optimistic and too not as paranoid as it should be, I consistently wonder why that doesn't happen literally almost every day. Okay,
that's part of it.
Right? Maybe. Is that
Mostly, I'm glad because my son is obsessed with the subway right now. He's going to be the Q train tomorrow for Halloween. So very, very obsessed. I'm like, oh
my
son,
God, that's adorable.
Oh gosh, but I have to ride the subway with him.
Will he always be 7 minutes late? Is that the
you know, certainly threat of repercussion is a big one. The NYPD is really amazing at what they do, but they also do understand that, like, if someone really wants to do something bad, like you can't actually prevent it.
One grenade. Yeah,
you can't.
Once a week would shut down this entire city. Just randomly tossed into a train. You don't have to kill anybody. Just toss it into a train car, and if one grenade one time a week would shut this entire city down.
Most people don't want to do that, which is good. There's that protecting us a little bit. There's the NYPD monitoring for threats all the time. You can stop people here and there. Like, for example, do you remember there were the pressure cooker bombs a few years ago in Chelsea, the Chelsea bombings? One of them was right outside my office. I was like, oh, the irony of that. Like, he wasn't very good at it, right?
So maybe it's harder than I'm making it out to be?
It could have been a lot harder.
It could be that.
He was kind of an amateur. Like, he picked random locations that were not the most highly trafficked, like, didn't really know the city.
I also think we'd get used to it. I think as I'm speaking, I'm like, we'd probably get used to a grenade a week. And just, oh, yeah, grenade went off.
Grenade
whatever,
a week
I'm late.
is a little much, but yeah.
Okay. All right, well, Chloe, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
It's my pleasure.
John?
Yeah, I'll jump back in. So thank you again, Chloe. Unbelievable. See, these are the kinds of topics that we bring. They're not the kind of topics that people generally think that they want to talk about. They're uncomfortable for some people. They're difficult to comprehend. And it's just great, Chloe. Thank you so much for coming out here and sharing that with us. That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a tribute to us, our country, and the people that we have here that can actually do the work, you know, get to the bottom of stuff, help the rest of us think about these things, because it's just too easy for us. It's just too easy, right? Too easy to do nothing. So thank you again so much. John, my partner, as always, did a great job. Our guests, thank you so much. We're going to sign off, but open house, Chloe will answer questions for as long as she can, and then we'll